As I walk along the river, I can hear the water rushing. I can hear my feet on the gravel. The chatter of passersby. I can hear some wind. And I'm looking through the river valley towards the peak of Mount Shiam, which is soaked in sunlight. In the low sun, late afternoon sun, sort of bathing everything in this low golden light. It's quite beautiful. The blackberry brambles, bare of fruit. And ahead of me are my siblings, and we're just out for a walk with coffee. I grew up hearing stories from the Fraser Valley, back when my family was living in northern BC, and the valley still felt like a land far, far away. Sure, some of the stories came from Abbotsford, and some from Chilliwack, where my mom had grown up. But the ones that felt most like lore, like legend, those stories always took place in Yarrow. I want to learn more about Yarrow because it seems like in BC, that's where a lot of this stuff lands geographically, at least in the past. Yeah, and that feels really significant. I want to honor that in terms of the historical context and also some of my own family history. So what happened in Yarrow? It's not just family history. It's one of the epicenters of this conflict. One of the places where the tension between the Mennonite and Mennonite Brethren churches took root. This is the Vedder River. It's December 31st, 2025. And this is what it looks like, I guess, to be a Mennonite of our generation who is also aware of some history. Here we are. Welcome to Yarrow. I'm Marnie Klassen. This is the Schism Between Us.
Hello, Church. It is a beautiful day outside. The sun just came out, and we're here, Jen and Sean and I, to talk about a decision that Ministerial Council just made on a recommendation from Mennonite Church, British Columbia. MCBC 2 years ago, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada suggested and encourages all our congregations to acknowledge that the land we're on here in the Fraser Valley is not originally our land as immigrants that came in as settlers.
That's Darnell Barkman. Darnell is the pastor of Yarrow United Mennonite Church. The audio you're hearing comes from a video posted on the church's YouTube channel on June 18th, 2020, a few months into the COVID-19 pandemic. In the video, Darnell and two others, Jen and Sean, sit socially distanced on a porch and talk about why the land acknowledgement matters.
We didn't choose that we would be part of dispossessing Indigenous peoples as settlers, for our own well-being even. But we need to feel the responsibility and bear our part of the burden for the history we've inherited.
The history that Darnell is referencing is pretty complex. I'm not going to explain settler colonialism to you here, but I am going to tell you a bit about Yarrow. The story begins back in the 1860s, when Volker Vedder and his sons bought up the land that would eventually become the village of Yarrow. Let's fast forward to 1917. On the other side of the world, the Bolshevik Revolution has broken out in Russia. The chaos, violence, and famine that come out of that create enormously difficult circumstances for the Mennonites in Russia. If you remember from episode 1, we talked a bit about the beginnings of the Mennonite Brethren, or MB, movement. That was largely in the Molochna colony in South Russia. The effects of the revolution were devastating on the Mennonites and MBs. The stories I grew up hearing about my great-grandparents in those days are simply atrocious and not something I even want to share on a public podcast like this. But long story short, the Mennonites and MBs start to leave Russia as they're able. They go to all sorts of places, including South America, but many come to Canada. As they land in Canada, the Mennonites, who are used to a colony life, settle in tight-knit communities. They get cheap land, usually taken or bought by land prospectors en masse, and then sold to Mennonite settlers, sometimes through the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization. Meanwhile, in the Yarrow area, the Canadian government is preparing to sell off a bunch of land, and they embark on a land reclamation project, the draining of Sumas Lake. Now, I want to pause here and mention that Sumas Lake was a sacred lake for local Indigenous groups, including the Stalu Nation. It was drained and turned into sellable farmland from 1920 to 1924. That basic fact is an environmental and colonial injustice. The Mennonites who settled in the area after the draining of Sumas Lake were not exempt from colonial responsibility. And I want to name that those Mennonites include my great-grandfather, George Reimer.
Okay, so I grew up in Yarrow with immigrant parents from the Ukraine, George Reimer and Lena, her maiden name was Weens. So they did not know each other from Russia. They met in Yarrow, where both his family and her family settled.
That's my grandma again, Elfrida Klassen. Her parents, George and Lena Reimer, were married in Yarrow on June 29, 1930. They were the second couple to be married in the Yarrow MB Church after its formation only a year prior, in 1929.
So I was third youngest from a family of 7. And I was born on Easter Sunday morning in 1941 to the chagrin of my older siblings because they could not go Easter egg hunting. And can you imagine that my family actually did that?
That's amazing.
Easter egg hunting?
That's amazing. In 1941.
Yeah, I know. So they were all shuffled off to Grandma Reimer's.
Yeah.
Her grandma's place.
Yeah.
While Mom gave birth to me on the kitchen table.
In Yarrow at that time, church was the center of life. That was especially true of the Yarrow MB Church. At its height in 1948, Yarrow MB had nearly 1,000 members. But according to various accounts, at least 1,200 to 1,400 people would show up on a Sunday morning.
I basically grew up in the MB Church. My parents were very involved, especially my dad, very involved in the MB Church. He served on the leadership board. He was a choir director. And Mom, of course, was a mother that stayed at home and took care of the children.
Despite church being the center of life, there was very little talk at home about faith and spirituality. I was surprised to learn this from my grandma. It was almost as if that nominalism that Bruce Gunther talked about in episode 1 had once again caught up with the MBs in Yarrow.
And I remember exactly sitting in the front, usually in the front, and my dad was conducting the choir. Mom was probably in the, back in the church with the little ones, like my brother Bob and my youngest sister Irene. And I remember being baptized. At that time, it was a creek in Yarrow called the Jordan.
No way.
It was called the Jordan River.
Wow.
I was maybe 13 or 14. And I remember in an evening when I had to give a testimony to the leaders in the church. They would scrutinize you whether they believed you were actually a Christian.
Wow.
Yeah. And so my dad was on the board at that time too. And so he had never asked me about my personal faith. We just didn't talk about it as a family. It was sort of assumed. Yeah. So I remember vividly driving with him to that meeting Sunday in the evening. It must have been a weekday evening. And then he asked me, "Are you sure that you want to go through with baptism?" That's the only time I ever remember him asking me about something like that. I'm also thinking that he's probably going to be asked by his co-elders in the church whether he actually talked with his daughter.
Right.
He waited till the last minute. That's what I'm thinking. The only time they ever heard my testimony would have been in front of the church.
George was the choir conductor at Yarrow MB during this time. It's been really fun picking through archives and history books and seeing his name all over the place. So, I have lots of family history in Yarrow, so I'm on the MB side.
Yeah.
Like, my great-grandfather, I just learned last night from Bruce that Yarrow MB at its peak was like 1,000 members.
Yeah. This was the biggest MB church back then.
I had no idea. My great-grandfather was the choir conductor.
So Christina's Omanopa they have this, he wrote a book, and in his book he writes about coming to Yarrow. And when you would step into the Yarrow MB church on a Sunday morning, you felt like you just stepped into heaven, because the singing was like everyone was singing 8-part harmony, and it was all they knew. So it was just like the most remarkable thing. So that would have been your great grandfather who was like conducting heaven in Yarrow.
Yeah, George Primer.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Earlier this week, as I was working on this episode, I phoned my grandma to clarify some dates. She ended up retelling a story that she told me during our interview back in the spring. A story about her grandmother, Helena Eck.
My dad, his mom married the second time. Her husband died in Russia, Ukraine. She moved here with my dad, my Uncle Pete, and I think a sister. Yeah, 2 sisters maybe.
Helena was 51 at the time that she and a few of her children immigrated to Canada. Their ship, the SS Metagamma, arrived on August 8th, 1926, in Quebec City. Helena arrived in Canada a widow with 3 adult children: George, my great-grandfather, Peter, and her daughter Marichin and her husband. Grandma had told me in our interview this spring that Helena had remarried in Canada, and she actually remembers her step-grandfather, a Mr. Abram Nicol. But it was during our phone call this past Monday that we both learned something about that marriage. I pulled up a genealogy report while we chatted and discovered that it was a mere 10 days later, on August 18th of 1926, that Helena Eck and Abram Nicol were married in Crowfoot, Alberta. They were not related, they came from different communities back in Russia, and they immigrated on different ships in different years. But somehow, within 10 days of Helena living in North America, they were wed. Grandma tells me that it was a loveless marriage of convenience.
One of his sisters died of TB. Her husband also died a while later.
Wow.
Leaving 5 children.
That was Marichin and her husband, my great-grandfather George's younger sister and brother-in-law.
So grandma, like their grandma as well, would have been my grandma as well, took on the responsibility of these children. Her husband, her second husband, did not want her to take that responsibility. Subsequently, she defied him and did it anyway.
Wow.
She was excommunicated from the church because she didn't obey her husband.
I need to pause here. I've struggled with putting together this episode, struggled to clarify its identity and name why I feel so strongly that the story of Yarrow matters. One thing's been clear to me the whole time. I want the world to hear this story. I've grieved Marichin's death this week. I felt angry at the necessity of Helena's marriage to Abram Nicol. But this feels like the last straw. That he would try to prevent her, my own kin, from taking in her own grandchildren? It's an injustice. And to add insult to injury, that her community would disavow her for it. I find it completely unacceptable. I find it infuriating. But the story's not over, and what happens next changes the picture.
What she did was she still wanted to go to church.
Yeah.
She would wait till everybody was gone. She'd go late, sneak in the back, sit in the back, and then she'd leave before it was over.
Wow. And this was an MB church?
Yes.
Wow.
The Abbey Church in Yarrow.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Holy
See, that's also trauma.
Yes. Yes.
Control.
Yeah, and the readiness to kick people out. And that's still there.
That's us and them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the control, the othering.
And the fears.
Yeah.
It's all motivated by fear, driven by fear. Because we don't understand this. It's just fear. We don't want to understand it. We just have to keep it this way so that we're protected and we can be safe this way in our little bubble.
I feel so sad. So sad for Helena. So sad for everyone who, like her, was excommunicated from the Yarrow MB Church in those years. Whether for believing the wrong thing, or disobeying an unloving husband, or for marrying the wrong kind of Mennonite. And I also feel proud. Proud of Helena for sitting in the back row, for refusing her own excommunication. And I'm proud of my grandma, Elfrida, for being so unafraid to name these things. Things from a good childhood that don't fit anymore, that she can name as trauma and fear and othering. That's hard work, and I don't take for granted that just any 85-year-old is willing to engage it. I wonder if she's partly able to name these things because of my late grandfather, John. You see, the Klassen side of my family also has an excommunication. That one because of a marriage. When my great-grandfather, Aaron, married my great-grandmother, Katarina, it was much to the dismay of her General Conference Mennonite father, who did horrific things to try to prevent the marriage. And in the end, she was kicked out of her conference. It was only during my interview with Grandma Elfrida that this parallel hit me. Wow, so on the Klassen side, we have an excommunication because of an interdenominational marriage.
Yep.
And on your side, we have an excommunication because of disobeying a husband.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Holy cow. That's a lot of trauma.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Getting kicked out on both sides of the family?
Yeah.
That's crazy. Oh, man.
And your grandpa, when he heard that in the Yarrow church, when people were being excommunicated for dumb things or traditional, I don't know, like a divorce, for example.
Grandpa John was the pastor of Yarrow MB years after the settlement of the village and the creation of the church. My dad was a little kid, so this would have been in the early 1970s.
He sought to mend those fences. He would look up people and try to mend the fence, mend the brokenness.
There has been so much pain. So many families share this story. That's why I'm telling you this. Not because I'm just some family history nut, but because this is a cultural tale about broken bonds, fractured relationships. But just maybe, it can also be a story about reconciliation. I've sometimes wondered what it would look like for the MB conference to issue a public apology.
You know, one church in Williams Lake did that.
Really?
Yes, in the MB Herald.
Huh.
I read that.
Wow, when would that have been? Like what decade?
In the 70s, maybe early 80s. They apologized on behalf of the leadership that had been there, that had dealt wrongfully and without love and mercy to people in that congregation. And they published it publicly. And I have to tell you, this cousin that is still alive, she still has a grudge against the MB Church. And I was thinking, hold on, I have talked about this numerous times, that it would be so good for the leadership at the Abbey Church in Yarrow to do something like that as well, because so many people were hurt and left the church because of policy that was unloving, that was no mercy, no compassion, no understanding, no listening. Yeah. But this church in Williams Lake did that.
But there's a story that was published in the MB Herald about an MB pastor who went and joined a Mennonite church. And I think it was in Manitoba somewhere. And when he was in the Mennonite church, he discovered that he started to hear from his members or something that they were not allowed to become members of MB churches if they were moving somewhere else and they were MC. And then or GC, but it was probably old GC back then. They weren't allowed to just join. And he went and looked it up, and it was actually in the National Faith and Life Committee documents that the Mennonite Brethren Church doesn't recognize GC baptism as real Christian baptism. And it wasn't, and I always thought, like growing up in B, I always thought, it was like pouring and sprinkling or dunking. It was like the mechanics were the issue. Yeah. But it wasn't that. It was like, no, you're actually not a Christian. I just learned about this or I had stumbled across it in some conversations and then looked it up, and I go, and what ended up happening was this pastor then, who was former MB pastor, now GC, went to national MB leadership, talked about this. And it's in the Herald. There's an article about him being invited to the MB national conference and having an official apology and like addressing this thing that we didn't treat you even as Christians. And that was Christina's Opa and Oma, when they came from Germany in World War II, at the end of World War II, they came here to Yarrow, and they lived just out of town here, and they were going to become members and attend at Yarrow MB, but they were going to have to be rebaptized. And I've heard that story 1,000 times. Members of my congregation have told me versions of that story. And I assumed, dunked, sprinkled versus dunked. Yeah. This like made so much more sense. It was like, it wasn't about the mechanics. It was that you weren't actually Christian. You have to be rebaptized. And it blew me away. Like, it was just, I had no idea. And so, but in 2010, they made amends. We recognized this. We officially tried to do something to go like, we were wrong. I'm sorry.
There are various stories like Darnell's, or the one Elfrida shared, that happened in Williams Lake. But are they enough? How do we make amends for the wrongs of the past? It brings me back to that 2020 YouTube video.
We just are so often blind to it. And our everyday lives, we just go about our own life and our own responsibilities that we all have and that are good, but we forget that we have our own history, and because we're not the ones who are suffering from it, it's really easy to forget. And so I think that's why it's important to have these kinds of statements that just remind us what our role is in this, and that we're not the ones who are suffering from this, but it's our responsibility to try to keep it front of mind, to try to find ways that we can reconcile.
Yeah, I think too is like Jesus primarily came for these 4 directional relationships, right? To reconcile us to God, to each other, within ourselves, and with creation. Mm-hmm. And so this is the basic step to acknowledge we weren't always here. Yeah. And the process of how this land came from your people, like in this case, the Stolo Nation, having used this land and taken care of this land before we came, but now we came in and we weren't part of a conversation with them, or if we were a part of it, it was more taking, not genuinely dialoguing. And how do we learn to live more justly and participate in reconciling the past and reconciling the future?
How do we? How do we reconcile the wounds of the past? And especially when those amends have not been made, when the animosity between 2 groups continues, when the impulse to excommunicate evolves into the impulse to cancel. I hope, I pray that my grief for Marichen, for Helena, for George this week, I pray that it may be some small part of that reconciliation. Thank you for listening to The Schism Between Us. I'm your host, Marnie Klassen. This series is supported by Menno Creative, a program of Canadian Mennonite magazine. Some very good folks made this story possible. At the beginning, and again now, you've heard an arrangement of In the Rifted Rock, arranged by Michaela Turner and performed by Marta Bonnet-Wiebe, Allegra Friesen-Epp, Matthew Veith, Solomon Schlegel, Courtney Kuhl-Schlegel, and Isaac Kuhl-Schlegel. The other music you've heard throughout was written and performed by Jamie Terpstra. Graphic design by Tiff Wu. Technical production and sound design by Matthew Veith. Thank you to all of these colleagues and friends without whom this project would still be just an idea. And thank you, dear listener, for coming with me to Yarrow. See you next time.